In this video, we are going to talk about functional groups. So we've been talking about organic molecules, and organic molecules have carbon in them, and that carbon can form long chains or short chains with other carbon atoms, and then there can be like hydrogens hanging off of the side of those carbons. If you take off one of those hydrogens, you can replace it with something called a functional group. And functional groups are chemical groups that affect molecular function, hence functional group, by being directly involved in chemical reactions. So functional groups are parts of a molecule that have a really big impact on the way that the molecule behaves and interacts with other molecules. Here's an example. These are two steroid hormones. On the left, we have estradiol, which is a form of estrogen. On the right, we have testosterone. And if you think about all of the changes that estrogen and testosterone can create in the body and how different those changes might be, you might be surprised to learn that they're actually really, really similar molecules. So here you can see the differences between estradiol on the left and testosterone on the right are outlined in those blue boxes. And other than that, they're pretty similar. So functional groups can have a really big impact on the effects of a molecule in the body, for example. We are going to go over 7 functional groups that are important in the chemistry of life. I'm going to show you each of these. So this is a hydroxyl group. So it's when a carbon has an oxygen and a hydrogen attached. And hydroxyl makes sense because it's hydrogen, oxygen. So this, I think, is one of the easier ones to learn, hydroxyl group. This is a carbonyl group. So what we have here is the carbon is double bonded to an oxygen, and then the carbon is also bonded to 2 other things. And depending on where it is in the molecule, it can be called different things like a ketone or an aldehyde. We're not going to worry about that. This is a carboxyl group, which is a kind of carbonyl group. A carboxyl group has the C double bonded to an oxygen, and then it's got an OH hanging off of the side. So remember this one, this is going to show up in amino acids, and it's going to show up in fatty acids and elsewhere. So we're going to see this a lot later on. And something that the carboxyl group can do is if you had this chemical structure in like water, say, that hydrogen might pop off of the oxygen. And so you could see a carboxyl group written as COOH, or you could see it written as like COO with the minus there. Those are both carboxyl groups. This is an amino group. It's another one that's really important in proteins. So amino groups are in amino acids. And an amino group, you maybe can remember that it has an N in it. So it's the one that has nitrogen and 2 hydrogens. And amino groups do the same thing but backwards that the carboxyl group did. So amino groups can, like if you put it in water, maybe a hydrogen could attach to the amino group. So you might see it as NH2, or you might see it as NH3+. This is a sulfhydryl group. This is another one where the name makes it kind of easy. So sulfur, hydrogen, sulfhydryl. So when you have sulfur and hydrogen hanging off of a carbon, it's a sulfhydryl group, and these are involved in, these help like keep proteins bound together. We probably won't get into that very much, but this is a phosphate group. Phosphate groups are really important in DNA and RNA. They're involved in ATP, which is one of the molecules that we use to store energy. And they're also involved in a kind of lipid called a phospholipid that's in cell membranes that we'll talk about later. So we're going to see phosphate groups a lot, so make sure you can recognize this one. So you can see that it's a P, a phosphorus surrounded by oxygens. This is a methyl group. Methyl has a carbon with 3 hydrogens on it. So there you go, that's a methyl group. So why do we care about functional groups? Why did I just tell you a bunch of names and show you different molecular structures? So they're actually really important in the 4 types of a macromolecule that we're going to be talking about today. So let's start with carbohydrates. This is, I believe this is glucose. So glucose is made up of a carbon backbone. There's some hydrogens hanging off of it. And then you'll notice a bunch of these OHs. Do you remember what those are called? Those are hydroxyl groups. Proteins also have functional groups. I mean, all the organic molecules have functional groups. So let's look at amino acids, which make up proteins, which we're going to talk about later on in this chapter. This is an amino acid. So on the left, there is an amino group. That's where amino acid gets its name. Well, I was going to quiz you. Oh well. What is the one on the right called? So we've got the carbon and the oxygens. It's a carboxyl group. So that is the structure of an amino acid. We'll talk about it more later. Why do we care about functional groups? Because they're important in DNA and RNA. So this is the subunit of DNA. It's called a nucleotide or RNA. And so the green is a sugar, and on the right-hand side is something called a nitrogenous base. So don't worry about that. But on the left-hand side, what do you recognize? It's a phosphate group. And then why do we care about functional groups when it comes to fat? So we already saw an example of lipids and functional groups. So here we have cholesterol. Cholesterol is a lipid. It's a hydrophobic molecule, doesn't like water, and that last picture was because it can build up in your arteries and block your blood flow, but it's also does good things. So anyway, carbohydrate has all of these methyl groups hanging off of it. You see those? And it's got, what is that one? A hydroxyl group hanging off of it. And then again, this is just to show you how, so cholesterol is really closely related to all of these hormones as well. So we have testosterone and estradiol again, but we've also got progesterone, which is the hormone that promotes pregnancy. We've got cortisol in the upper right, which is a stress hormone. So again, small changes in molecules, slight differences in their functional groups can lead to really big functional differences. And as we move through the course, I'm going to be asking you so we're going to talk about how proteins and lipids and carbohydrates and nucleic acids are made of smaller subunits. And you're going to need to be able to recognize the structures of each of those subunits. So knowing the functional groups is going to help you say, oh, I remember an amino acid has an amino group and it has a carboxyl group. Or, a nucleotide has a phosphate group on it, something like that. So the four of these seven, if you had to focus on four, I would say focus on the hydroxyl group, focus on the phosphate group, focus on the amino group, and focus on the carboxyl group, because those are the four that are going to come up when we're talking about those different subunits of macromolecules in the upcoming lecture videos.